So yeah, it's great to be able to work with some folks who are really dedicated to their art and craft as musicians, and also as aspiring teachers and educators. And that's why I call myself a teaching artist, really, because I have dual careers as a performing and recording artist, and also as an educator. So I'm originally from Seattle. Actually, here's me in 1996. So this is right when I was really getting into saxophone. And yeah, I moved back there when I was done with school, and I have been really working since I finished school my whole career as a freelance musician and educator, all outside the world of traditional employment. A private studio, doing a lot of workshops, guest artist work, and that's something we can get into. I'm going to allow some times for questions as we finish. But I'm going to present a little bit on some of the topics you've been diving into: deliberate practice and flow, and some practical ways I look at actually creating learning environments for myself and for my students. A lot of this, when we talk about research, Fred who said a lot of this starts with me search. For me, I was trying to figure out for myself why, when I was that age, my hair was sticking out everywhere. That's when I was really getting into saxophone, and there's sometimes I would just get really into learning something new, learning a new solo, and I would just get, which I now can be described as a flow state. I would just be totally absorbed, days would go by, and sort of explosive, sort of some massive growth at that point in my life. And there was other times where I didn't really feel like I had the motivation to get my saxophone out of the case to warm up, and really trying to figure out what are the environments that light people up. And here's kind of hard to see an example. I do a lot of group improvisation workshops, so I work with some jazz players, but also some musicians who have maybe never improvised before, classically trained musicians or people from diverse backgrounds, and trying to come up with the environments and that's engaging and effective. Thinking about, you've been in classes before where, again, if you're in flow, time is just flying and you're totally engaged, versus another class or a lesson where you're just kind of staring at the clock, waiting for it to be over. So really, what are these conditions? And I don't know, I sent a couple TED Talks to Josh, which you should check out if he may have forwarded them to you. One was by Dan Coyle, who wrote this book called The Talent Code. He's studying the science of expertise, drawing a lot on the work of Erickson, but how we learn, how we develop skills. And I have a clip from an interview from a podcast, actually. This actually isn't in the book, where he talks about an ideal learning environment. Pose a question for all of you.
Think about the environments that light people up the most and that create the most motivation. And if we are going to sort of pick an ideal environment that does that, I would say it's...
Here's the questioning part. So what do you think it is? What is an ideal learning environment? It might be a classroom, it might be something else. So where's an environment where people learn a lot in a short period of time? One thing you may know about Dan Coyle is he went to, I should have mentioned this before, studied these talent hotbeds, which were relatively small communities that would produce possibly impossible numbers of world-class performers in a specific area, in the arts and sports and chess. So anyone have an idea of a learning environment that you've been in or that you've observed? Summer festival.
It's very intense and everybody has a shared goal that they want to achieve.
Absolutely. And it's, yeah, okay. Any other thoughts?
I think it's more like something like student classes that we could share ideas and to play something. Since for student class, everybody some of them gonna play, and the teacher will pose some questions. The students will give some answers, but these answers could while I was in the student class, I could learn more from the ideas. Since if we are in a student class, the piece we might be all played before, so it's kind of like reviewing since the piece might be played a long time ago, but while we review for that, we're gonna come up with more new ideas. So I think student class is a good chance to really absorb some new ideas instead of really listening to the playing of our student mates. I think student class works.
So is that the type of class where all the students from a single private instructor come together and play for each other? Is that what you're describing? Okay. Somebody's call that a studio class. Got it. Okay, so his example that Dan Coyle comes up with is not in fact from music, but I think it may be in line with with especially the summer festival what you're talking about. So
I would say it's a skateboard park. Like, kids go to a skateboard park and they get really, really good at skateboarding in a short amount of time. You know, it is incredibly motivated for certain kids. Why? You know, why? If we could teach algebra like kids learn to skateboard in a skateboard park, we'd be really, really good at algebra, right? But what are the ingredients of that environment, of that learning space? And the ingredients seem to be these vivid models of what you want to be. Not of like who you admire, but of the dude you want to become, right? I don't just like admire that skateboarder. I want to do that trick and I want to be as cool as him, you know, in every way. I want to be that guy. And so when that identity piece gets put into the equation, I think that lightning is a lot more likely to strike. And the other element that place has, of course, is tons of repetition and failure and struggle. You know, you fall off the skateboard a lot when you're first starting out, and you don't have a coach sort of telling you what to do. You're figuring it out yourself, so there's a lot of ownership. So this feeling of like you're struggling on your own in a sort of a tough environment, you know, but right around the edge of that environment is this enchanted circle of people who are awesome and who you want to be, and you want to join that circle. You know, you just don't want to sort of get a little better or get good to please your parents or achieve some level of competency. You want to be somebody.
So the skateboard park model, and I think this is a lot like the summer festival. Most people are there because they want to be there. You know, they identify as musicians. These are the people you want to be around, and this really resonates with my own experience, in myself, and with my students. You know, seeing explosive growth and motivation. It's not usually in isolation, just locking yourself in the practice room for 10 hours a day, but you feel like you're part of something. And you know, I'm a skateboarder. You know, this is what skateboarders do, and these are who I hang out with. This is how we dress, and in the process, getting really good at skateboarding. And this is also in line with, I just read this book called Atomic Habits by James Clear, some of the science about how we change our own, break bad habits, start new ones. And here's this little graphic he comes up with, which he calls the 3 layers of behavior change. So we can get really obsessed about the outcomes. Often in education, we're like, okay, well, here's what we're gonna grade, just worrying about these final outcomes, whether it's an audition or a grade, something like that. What he says is, these 3 layers. We go a little bit deeper, and where he says some of these goals themselves can be overrated. We go deeper to the underlying processes and systems and habits. You know, what are the things you're doing on a daily basis? And then at the very core is the identity. You know, this is who I am, this is what I do. You know, you don't have a skateboarder, I don't know, who says something like, oh, I've got to practice skateboarding today. I mean, maybe they do, but they want to go and hang because it's part of who they are. I'm a skateboarder, I hang out at the skateboard park all day. And the behavior change is much more likely to happen when all these things are in line with each other. When your identity is in line with your habits, in line with the outcomes. And, okay, so let's get to, you did reading Anders Ericsson, some deliberate practice. I want to show you this, just touch on that. There's this graphic I got. Has anyone seen the Bulletproof Musician blog? Anyone seen that? Noah Kageyama, he teaches peak performance psychology at Juilliard, and talking about all things with performance anxiety, practice habits, all these kind of things. But he took, this is from his online course, which is really, really good, a graphic, kind of taking deliberate practice and making a quick formula out of it. And I use this all the time for myself and for teaching. And you can build these into some of your, I can send this thing out as a PDF if you want it. I just have it up on the wall. I don't know if this is in his, is something like this in Peak? I haven't read Peak
Not
yet.
quite this
Yeah.
pressed.
I like it. I have not read Peak. I've read some of his older articles. It sounds like I need to check out the latest book. But define, and some of it just seems so painstakingly obvious when you look at it until you start going through it. I'm a saxophone player. Okay, define the goal. Student, play a low C on saxophone that's very clear, with a clear response. Go for it. Okay. Evaluate the result. Did you hit the goal? I love all the arrows missing the target there. Evaluate the result. Did you hit the low C? No. Identify the problem. Well, the notes split and it kind of went up, identify exactly what's wrong. And this is the point where sometimes people are retreating to, oh, I'm terrible, I suck at this, or hiding because they don't want someone to see the mistake, or they think that they're just not good enough and they'll never get it and they quit. And I still do this to myself all the time. Oh, I'm not getting it. Okay, identifies the cause. Well, this is where it's a very experimental process, like a scientist. Well, what is the cause? Is it, in the case of the saxophone, is there not already enough pressure with the mouth? Is the reed in the wrong place? Is one of the holes of the saxophone leaking? You have to get to what is actually the root cause, and then coming up with possible solutions. In this particular case, I just came off the top of my head, the solution could be take a little more mouthpiece in your mouth, or get your saxophone fixed, or there's a whole bunch of different things, and then testing the possible solutions. And you start again, go for it, did you get it? Okay, then you're done. But I like this because it starts with the assumption that whatever the problem is, it's solvable, and it's not necessarily some personal weakness or lack of natural talent, that it's being obsessed about the solution can get you where you want to go. So I'll send this thing out. I just have it up in my studio, and I sometimes go through this automatically when I have students, but then when I have it there, I'll have them go through the same process. And then where I can be helpful is sometimes identifying the cause and possible solutions. They may come up with some on their own, but I may, with experience, be able to point them towards some as well. So here's one bit that this is a blog article, but in some of it sounds like Anders Ericsson may have changed his tune a little bit on this. I'm going to pull up a quote from him on my phone while I do this. Let's see. Do not have this ready to go. So Anders Ericsson, when he was studying musicians, his initial research came from studying conservatory violinists in Berlin. And Josh, correct me if I screw up any of the.
It was in Europe somewhere,
yeah. Yeah. Okay. That I can tell you is in Berlin, and he was measuring who was successful by who won the most competitions. So a lot of our view on skill acquisition, developing as a musician, is on that narrow lens. Let's see. I'm going to find his quote. But he believes that flow states and this idea of deliberate practice and carefully constructed learning activities are antithetical to each other. He says, so flow, a state of diffused attention, is almost antithetical to focused attention required by deliberate practice to maximize feedback and information about corrective action. So in contrast to play, deliberate practice is a highly structured activity, the explicit goal of which is to improve performance. Specific tasks are invented to overcome weaknesses, and performance is carefully monitored to provide cues for ways to improve it further. We claim that deliberate practice requires effort and is not inherently enjoyable. That's the part I have issue with. Individuals are motivated to practice because practice improves performance. In addition, engaging in deliberate practice generates no immediate monetary rewards and generate costs associated with access to teachers and training environments. And, so I certainly take issue with this, especially with the, we can use the skateboard park analogy. They are, that environment can be tough. You can be struggling, but the idea that anything that requires effort isn't enjoyable doesn't really line up with a lot of my experience, my students, and I'm coming from the jazz perspective. I have some examples of some of my teachers and the way that they look at practicing. This idea of mastery being 10,000 hours of doing something really hard, then you emerge a master, rather than this idea of it being this lifelong pursuit of learning and growth. So we have this idea, that practicing. Here we go. This is what we think of think of practicing where you're doing something rather tedious in isolation, and that we're relying on, here we go, got the slug here, work ethic, delayed gratification, and willpower, that you just have to gut it out for 10,000 hours and then suddenly you'll be a master. But there's a problem with this. Naturally, I mean, willpower is a limited resource, and humans, we're not necessarily really good at willpower. Some of us are better than others. I mean, if we were all really good at willpower, we'd all practice all day, we'd all eat really well, we'd all go to the gym, 9 days a week and all of that. Let's see. So what we end up doing is, if you saw that other talk I sent out, Dan Pink, relying on this rewards and punishment model when we're teaching. Well, the only way to get, if we're gonna go on the assumption that practicing and learning music is inherently unenjoyable, we have to use grades, we got the drill sergeant there, some kind of carrots and sticks, rewards and punishment in order to get people to comply and meet standards. But there are some long-term problems with kind of this homework model. Well, again, in that book Drive by Dan Pink, I said, if you saw that TED Talk, talks about there's some research and motivation showing that if you, by using rewards and punishment, sort of external things, it can work really well for very, very linear algorithmic tasks. If you're stuffing envelopes or doing something where there's a very clear goal and outcome, it can be effective. But for anything more creative, it actually dampens creativity and can actually squash some internal drive. For instance, if you were really into going to the skateboard park, but then suddenly there was a skate assessment that was measuring your tricks, and then your parents wanted you to get better, and then you had to get grades and assessments and all that, sometimes that can actually dampen the initial interest you had in the activity. And so another way, again, coming back to practicing, I've actually this is a teacher, Josh and I both studied with, here's Jerry Bergonzi. I'm also going to take this to kind of group learning environments as well. So this is one of the saxophone professors here, just one of the top players in the world. And what he says about practice, this was an interview in Downbeat magazine. He says, I love to practice, and I don't practice to get better. That's my secret. I practice because I like practicing. And people say, do you do yoga? And he says, well, I should do his voice. Yeah, every time I take out my instrument. I get in that zone physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. That's the yoga. Union. I'm into it. That's why we all play music. We're addicted to the present tense. It's not, let's talk about me. It's about getting in the zone. So I see that as a model. I'm like, whatever that is, I want some more of that. To be that he's able to get to an elite level, one of the best, most regarded players in the world, by being in the zone constantly, kind of called hacking flow, getting into flow while increasing his skills. So I want to look at just some of these environments that can allow, what I'm really interested in is aligning skill development with flow, or intrinsically rewarding activities that are enjoyable to do whether or not you're getting better, and getting all of that to line up. So I'm trying to do that in my own practice for sure, and as I'm designing workshops, I have to make those kind of experiences happen. As I said, I'm doing a lot of this as carving out my own path as an independent business person. So I have to make a kind of experience that people like and want more of, so they tell other people about it, so more people will hire me, so I can support my family. So it's tied in. For me, it's tied in with my practice as an artist, and also for how I pay my bills. Let's see. I'm gonna skip this one. All right, so this idea of intrinsic motivation, Dan Pink outlines a lot of this in the book Drive, which I think every teacher should take a look at. What is it that compels someone to want to hang out at the skateboard park all day? So from the research, he comes up with the idea that this internal drive comes from 3 areas. So autonomy, having agency over what you're doing, how you do it, when you do it, that it's not coming from up above. Like, here's the area, like the snowboarder, or if a musician's playing, whatever it is, that they have some choice over why they're learning. So mastery, the idea of constantly getting better at something that's important to you, and purpose, connecting to something that's larger than yourself. And, well, let's see, won't go on that tangent. So what can we do to make, I've got a kid doing homework here, how can we take something like musical practice, leveling up our skills to make it feel less like homework and more like the skateboard park or a summer festival? I mean, for me, my time at NEC as a jazz major, we had tons of autonomy. It's probably still like that. You could decide who you studied with, what you were working on, who you played with, and it was really inspiring being here around people that were really super serious about their art, their craft, developing a voice, but it wasn't cutthroat. We weren't worried about, at least in the jazz department, we weren't worried about making the top band, because it was a very flat kind of environment. People who played this kind of music hung out with this group, and some people, gravitated toward different faculty members depending on their aesthetic of music and how to make those happen. So I was just telling Josh earlier about, this is author Stephen Kotler wrote a book called The Rise of Superman and created the Flow Genome Project about how to hack flow. And they've done some research. It doesn't rise to the level of the scholarship that you're used to with peer-reviewed studies. However, reading some of these things, it really helped with some frameworks. It's helped a lot for crafting learning activities, but there's a lot more research to be done. If I was going into like research mode, this is something I would be really interested in studying myself, but in another lifetime, maybe aligning high flow learning environments with skill development. So, and this came from, Csikszentmihalyi, a lot of his work was about finding just more happiness and well-being and engagement in day-to-day life. These Flow Genome Project guys started with these extreme sports athletes, people, Danny Way jumping over the Great Wall of China on a skateboard with a broken ankle because he was in the zone, or all these insane feats of human athleticism is how they started getting into it. But they came up with a series of flow triggers. So these are the environments that help that bring us into the here and now. And there's a whole bunch of them that they come up with. So this idea that flows follows focus. So any of these things that help draw people's attention into the present moment can help get you into flow. So for this, it requires total concentration. You guys seen that movie? So I see when my dog looks at a critter like that, it's just narrowed attention. So if you're, there's some research says we're not great at multitasking. So we have, total concentration on the task at hand. So we have some novelty. I put a squirrel in underpants, gets people to pay attention. But something that's a little bit different, looking at a cupcake, there was some good novelty embedded into your, oh, what's that? Something different. That's not what I'm used to or pay attention to. Some unpredictability, we're not going to know what's happening next. I'm using a little bit of unpredictability and novelty with you guys now with squirrels and underpants, just to be like, whoa, what's the outcome going to be? And this is something that Bergonzi talks about, being in discovery zone, which I kind of call self-directed learning, fueled by curiosity. You've probably been there. You kind of want to learn. You might want to learn a new instrument on your own, or something that you're just curious about, and follow that thread, whether or not you're being assigned. We talked about risk. This is something that pulls us into the here and now. When you realize that you're not just turning in an assignment, you have to come up here and present in front of the entire class. That kind of thing. Your performance. And our brains are wired in a way that a physical threat or physical risk actually sets off the same alarm system in your brain as some kind of creative or emotional performance. Here we go. Skiing at the top of the Matterhorn. Actually, the video says Matterhorn. I don't think it really is, but. Even though you're not up there, it's getting you to pay attention. Anyway, similar thing happens when you're presenting, again, emotional or social risk. We're wired that way, and that's where fight or flight can kick in. That's a whole other talk about that. Shared goals. Someone mentioned that earlier. That's really important in the environment you're in. When you think about it, if you're in a band, and half of the group is really committed to the music and elevating the music, making the best performance possible, and the rest of the group is kind of like, okay, what do I have to do to meet the requirement? What do I have to do to get an A? it doesn't have that kind of magic that you need, that you might get something like a, you can make your summer festival example. Then Goldilocks tasks, right? This port is too hot, this is too cold. So here's the Flow Genome Project made this graphic on the Flow channel. I can send this one too, but to balance the skill and challenge ratio, right? If your skills are too high for what you're working on, you tend to get bored. If it's too challenging, it induces anxiety. And so this idea of the flow channel sort of splits, sort of evenly splits anxiety and boredom. So finding that sweet spot. So if you're doing this even on your own, if you find yourself bored, up the level of challenge. If it's, then you can find the same thing. And for yourselves, for your students, as we are all continual students. Let's see. And here's one that so mindfulness, there's a brain on there. I don't know if you can see it, but the idea of really turning all your attention to the sensory experience of the here and now can really be helpful with finding engagement when you're doing something that doesn't have the novelty, that's more repetitive, something like, like warm-ups or long tones. I use mindfulness for myself and with my students for playing, say like long tones on saxophones, like, oh, this is boring. Like, what can we do to engage with the physical sensations of vibrations, to listen to the harmonics and the sound? There's all these sensory things you can do to take something that might not be novel and unpredictable, but as far as building some kind of ritual around it. And other examples, the idea of the Tom Sawyer effect. Anyone read Tom Sawyer? What's that? I think I was supposed to in high school. Never finished it. So and the story goes, he was supposed to paint his aunt's fence, and then he pretended like he was having a really good time and tricked all his friends into doing it for him, and they actually paid him, in gifts and money for the opportunity to just do the job for him. So the Tom Sawyer effect is turning work into play, and we had some of that going on. And this is super powerful. As an example, let's see. So it's sort of an unlikely example. Well, not unlikely. Wait, I organized here. Okay. Let's go on. Okay, here's an example of the Tom Sawyer effect. So my daughter's in these group piano lessons. She started at age 4. She's 6 now. Musical monsters. My friend Michael Stegner wrote this. So it's a really cool integrated approach. They start reading on just a one-line staff, and they're playing do, re, mi in both hands. And they're singing and doing body solfege and doing composition projects and having dance parties. And she loves going because it's a group and it's all of her little buddies are there. It's a little mini skateboard park, I suppose. But there's all of these games embedded into the methodology. So I actually took the training. And so for instance, when she's supposed to practice at home, like, okay, Addie, it's time to play your piano songs. And it's like, I don't feel like it, I don't want to. But I can just say, you want to play the cupcake game? It's like, no. How about you're the teacher and I'm the student? No. How about Island? She's like, okay, yeah, let's play Island, which is every time she plays a repetition, she draws a big circle on the whiteboard. Then every time she plays a repetition, she tells me what animal to draw. She's like, now draw a hamster and a flying unicorn. So here's an example of Island. This is Star Wars Island. So I'd like Google the Millennium Falcon and see what it looked like. But then she's just happily playing, and she's doing all the repetitions. She's building her skills for sure. But it's just aligned with this kind of goofy game. So I draw a little porg up there and all that. And one day she made a costume. She dressed up like a robot and wanted me to program her. So there she is. So I asked her to put on the robot. I programmed her to go walk around the house, go feed the dog, do 10 jumping jacks, go play the piano. And then she jumped up and did it. And I actually adapted. I did a talk for harmony faculty at Berkeley last week, and I actually took one of these games that was for my daughter when she was 4, and I made all I did was tweak the parameters of it and gave a version for Berkeley professors, and they were actually the same thing. Even worked. You turn it into a little bit of a game, and suddenly they were all engaged and kind of joking around in a way that was very integrated. So this card game, I won't go to the specifics of it, but I took some of the same principles of, it's a game like Go Fish. So they have a one-line staff, can't really see. So one kid's card, they each have this set of the same cards. So want to look at one card and say, do you have this card, Elliot, and play, do, re, mi, do, and then the kid it says, oh, is it? Then they like hold the cards, and if they match, they dump the cards. And once you get rid of first person to lose all their cards wins. But in order to do this, you need to be able to understand what's on the card. You need to be able to execute it in a way that someone else can recognize it and have the ear and be able to hear it as well. And then also keep track of who still has what cards to ask the right person the right question and that kind of thing. And actually, this is what I was talking to at Berkeley. Their harmony, a lot of their harmony assignments are very much on paper. Here's the theory, we're gonna write it all down. But I had an example that this can be more integrated. So I made a version of a bunch of minor modes. So I was having them, one would play it on the piano, and then another could see if they could recognize it, get rid of the cards. I did another one with, whoops, oh, I took that other one out. A series of cards, and it was actually pretty fun. Even one of them said, oh, this, I didn't know if it was really gonna work. It may have really fallen flat, but they're like, oh, that changed the whole environment of the room. It was normally a faculty meeting where they talk about policy, so they're all expecting to be bored, and instead we're playing the card game, which was, I got a video of that, it's pretty funny. Again, something that's very integrated, it's aligned with skill development, so that's one example of Tom Sawyer effect. So one of my groups, so I run this group improvisation workshop called Game Symphony Workshop, so I draw some ideas from theater games, and drawing particularly from, I use some novelty, unpredictability, Goldilocks tasks, some creative risks, there's some performance involved, and hopefully shared goals as a way to pull this together. Again, often working with groups of young kids, grown-ups, and it's a group improvisation workshop. And again, this is sort of tied into what I'm doing professionally. Anyway, so I have a little video, it's just a couple minutes, so you can see some of this stuff in action as I'm experimenting with this. I did not have this idea fully formed. I started doing it from engaging with groups of kids and grown-ups, seeing what worked, seeing what didn't work. It was just a long process of 10 years of trying to run these workshops and then figuring out what actually works. So here's a little bit of that, another example of these ideas in play. I pulled the video out because I was trying to email it to you. This works. So this is a high school orchestra improvising a piece after
The
40
Game Symphony
minutes.
Workshop is a creative music experience that helps musicians collaboratively improvise and compose their own music. Many musicians never experience the process of creating original music. Game Symphony ignites creativity through adaptations of improv theater games, conducted improvisation, an intro to jazz, and more. Improvisation is the source of paralyzing fear among many musicians with classical training. And the fear of being put on the spot is biological. It's wired into the fight or flight center of our brains. And this workshop experience helps ease fears by introducing improvisation as a series of community-building games and activities.
On your marks, get set, go.
When I was studying jazz at New England Conservatory,
There we
I was
are.
introduced to John Zorn's game piece Cobra. I also learned how to structure improvisation through musical limitations, and I discovered these approaches are fun and effective for musicians of all ages. The name Game Symphony comes from my mentor William Matthew, who says build and confident improbability. But there's serious.
So here's.
Says.
So they're each taking on a different emotion. It's sort of a way I trick them into playing solos in front of a crowd. We got a student
Some of the games
conductor.
are silly, but there's serious learning happening. The practices of experimentation, play, limitations, and reflection can transform musicians into skilled and confident improvisers. My background is in jazz, but the this workshop is about creative practices rather than a specific genre of music, so participants can bring in their own experience and passions into the workshop. My book, Creativity
All right,
Trigger.
so I use some of that, the novelty, the unpredictability to get everyone involved, is make as much as possible this kind of community environment where people feel safe experimenting. I mean, once they've made chicken sounds in front of all their friends, then then later on I've used this to build jazz combo programs, people that are terrified to play a solo. They're just kind of used to doing this, and we build that kind of environment. To get to some more listening intensive and more challenging things. Might be playing a jazz solo, could be collaboratively composing, more listening intensive things. So some of the novelty goes away later on, but that's part of what I've been up to since I was here 15 years ago. Okay, let's see. I can send out some of those things. I'll send them to Josh. I have some PDFs, some of the improvisation games. And this book, Creativity Triggers, which is a bunch of prompts and exercises that you can use. I use them in private lessons, also in this improvisation course I teach at Seattle Pacific University, to take some of these structures to start creating music. You could use some of these yourselves if you want to take a break from your rep and come up with a structure or a game to start mixing things up and creating some of your own music. All right, I'll leave it at that for now. Take some questions about any of this, or, I don't know, NEC 15 years ago, or freelancing, anything. Yeah.
Well, we have about 5 minutes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we had
Oh, yeah,
whatever. So, yeah. Whenever people have
Got a
to say.
question?
Not a question, but I do like the idea, because I've always been scared of improv as well.
Uh-huh.
And sometimes at summer festivals we would have activities that require improv, so
Uh-huh.
whenever it was my turn I'd get all tensed up. But I think the idea that you would say it's like a community engagement
Mhm.
thing, so it's not on your own but rather with other people, I think that really helps people to like open up, I think.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really good idea.
Awesome.
I was trying to say that.
Yeah, we associate improvisation with solo. If we're going to
Right.
improvise, we're going to solo. That right away you're on the spot. So it's kind of building a level of trust up to that
Yeah.
up to that point. And yeah, there's plenty of cultures that improvise in ways that are community oriented. And jazz in many respects, from the early days and some more modern practices, but when it comes to teaching it, yeah, it's very much you play a solo, you play a solo. And even then I introduced it with like a game called channel surfing, like you're switching channels on TV, and you're playing, now you're playing, and then it feels less like, oh, I have to come up with something great right now in front of all my friends or else they're gonna laugh at me, because that
Right.
triggers that stress response. Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. The thoughts, questions? I like awkward silences, so you can just let that go for the next 5 minutes.
But I have a question.
Yeah.
Is this like your project's really interesting?
Oh.
It's Game Symphony
Yeah,
Workshop
Game
thing.
Symphony Workshop.
And yeah, just wonder what do you think that the most important takeaway for these kids or audience who participate in the project?
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, part of it is that that they're able to be spontaneous and creative artists, really, because a lot of the time they're just following instructions the whole time. That it's just they're told exactly what notes to play, when to play them. That they don't have much autonomy. If they're playing I work with a lot of concert bands, jazz bands, orchestras. They're told exactly what to play, when they're going to play it, and all the creativity falls on the composer, possibly the conductor to some degree. So there's this sort of split between here's the creative people, here's the composers and the jazz musicians, and then other folks that end up being kind of cogs in a machine. You're just following instructions and not creating anything of your own. So for some of them, I hope it would take off into, some of them may be jazz players, some may collaboratively write their own chamber music, some may be improvisers, but sort of being a first step into creating their own pieces.
And so do you consider that would be some kind of alternative for deliberate practice?
Oh, an alternative
Yeah.
for it?
Or even
I call it,
like,
well, in this little book, I kind of outline some of the difference. Deliberate practice works really well when you have a really clear outcome. When the outcome is, I want to be able to play this scale at 16 notes at 144 beats per minute, and how do I get, so when it's a really clear-cut skill, deliberate practice is the most effective tool. But there are other areas in life, whether it's improvising or things that are more creative, we don't really know what the point B is. It might be, an interpersonal or romantic relationship, or improvising music, or starting a business, or solving a problem when no one knows what the answer is. Deliberate practice, that feedback can help, but sometimes if you don't know exactly where you're going out in the unknown, it's sort of a different toolbox. That's how I look at it. So there's some areas where it overlaps, and some where the creative stuff is not as efficient because you're kind of exploring and playing, and the idea of play isn't as, it's not efficient on purpose, and that's how we can be more creative. I can actually leave you with this quote from the author of a book. He's Stephen Nachmanovich, wrote a book called Free Play, Improvisation and Life and Music, one of my favorites. He's a new one coming out. He just posted this quote. Actually, it was on Facebook. Waiting for it. Tell the joke while this is loading. It's cool. Get a signal here. That's what I get for relying on the cloud. Okay, any other questions while I come up with this thing?
I don't know if this makes sense, but for the ideal learning environment, the example given was a skateboard park,
Yeah.
Which involves a community with a lot of people.
Yeah.
I was wondering how you could create an ideal learning environment in a one-on-one lesson, if that's possible, or some strategy.
It is. I think it works best when the student is already part of that community somewhere else. It's hard to do one-on-one. You can build really good rapport. Actually, I can look for this quote somewhere else. Mentorship. So you really want that kind of trust and back and forth. But I don't think you can. I think it's tough to build it all on your. Oh, I'm going to unplug this thing. See, I'm not good at multitasking. I didn't say that. And that's one reason I want to start doing more of these workshops and guest artist things. Primarily, my career has been a lot of private lessons, which I still love doing when it's the right students. But a lot of times, that whole group environment, building those dynamics is when the magic really happens. So it can be tough if you're doing private lessons with a student who doesn't have that kind of environment outside of the lessons. So sometimes you be creative and helping find the ways to connect with their peers. Yeah. So okay, the quote here from Stephen Nachmanovich is, "We," and he puts in parentheses, "modern Western people," whatever that means, but have developed a high regard for the idea of purpose, that you design a plan or proposal and then you execute it. But this is not how nature works, and it's not how most learning actually occurs. It's not how spontaneous, unscripted creativity works, which is the greater part of the world's music, poetry, art, invention. That improvising is the front door to thinking as nature thinks, not with narrowly deliberate purpose, but as part of an organic whole that evolves and learns. So that's a more eloquent answer to your question. So I love the deliberate practice formula. I'm use that all the time, but I see it as kind of a slice of something bigger, a more integrated, larger practice. So,
Well,
thank you for your attention.